Hi everyone! If you're watching this, thanks so much for wanting to learn more about my thesis entitled Revolutionary Women, Literary Performativity, Classical Pseudonyms, and the Public Sphere in the Correspondence of Abigail Adams and Mercy Otis Warren. In my thesis, I examined the epistolary correspondence between Adams and Warren from 1775 to 1777. During this time, these women engaged in a nuanced dialogue and literary performance in which they reimagined the relation between the classical and the modern, the stoical and the sentimental, the public and the private, the national and the domestic, and the masculine and the feminine as a means to actualize their historical and literary voices. So why turn to epistolary writing? During the late 18th century, many women's writings took place in very unconventional genres, one of which being letters. I believe it's important to look at these unconventional genres in order to include marginalized voices, such as the voices of women, in our literary and historical canons. Letter writing in particular occupied a unique intermediate space between the private and public spheres. For my thesis, while letter writing can be seen to occupy a macroscopic historical perspective, my thesis strives to unearth the microscopic literary perspective in order to dive deeper into more specific and interlocking conversations surrounding the private and public sphere, femininity, and performativity in order to differentiate rather than dichotomize these women's voices. How am I reevaluating the private and public spheres in relation to gender? The main scholar I used in this conversation was Elizabeth Dillon, who complicates Michael Warner's argument about public print culture by arguing that both an abstraction or depersonalization of authorship and an individuation or particularization of authorship exist in the public sphere. Dillon also accounts for women, unlike Warner, claiming that women were represented in the literary public sphere and that powerful public images of femininity identify women as private. One such example would be the public image of Republican motherhood. For my thesis, I used Dillon as a launchpad to argue that not only are abstraction and individuation both present, but women imagined ways to use both of these qualities to revise the relation between public and private. Finally, how can performativity mobilize women? The performative potential of letters was not merely in their ability to orally be read out loud in a public setting, but was actually very influential in the private creation of a literary pseudo-public sphere. This manifested itself many times through Roman allusions and pseudonyms. One such well-known one would be Publius, which is the name of a Roman leader which the collective authors of the Federalist wrote under. However, women were also employing Roman pseudonyms, as women possessed the tradition of female worthies, which consisted of a catalog of illustrious women for contemporary women to pull from in order to substantiate their progressive gender agendas. On August 27, 1775, Adams first takes on the name Portia, which is Brutus's wife and Cato the Younger's daughter, in her correspondence specifically with Mercy Otis Warren, and Mercy Otis Warren responds with taking on the name Marcia, which is Cato the Younger's wife. And this leads into my thesis, which is, while Adams and Warren are both concerned with the same end goal of figuring out how to best carve a space for women's historical and literary voices, such as their own, their letters as Portia and Marcia reveal the intricacies of their conversation, as both women choose to experiment with different approaches. Adams adopts a classical performance of stoical self-abnegation as a means to subversively legitimize her female patriotism, dismantle the Republican binaries of public versus private and male versus female, and achieve self-actualization in the public sphere. Adams also plays with using literary performativity as a means to circumvent stoical republicanism altogether, creating her own epistolary pseudo-public sphere in which women can occupy public positions of power. Warren, however, highlights the limitations of Adams's classical performance of stoical republicanism, opting for a new philosophical lexicon altogether, sentimentalism. Warren recuperates the sentimental in order to reframe virtue and patriotism as particularly feminine and to modernize performativity so that she can achieve self-actualization as a playwright and historian through the private epistolary sphere. For my close reading, I want to focus on the second portion of the Abigail Adams chapter, which is creating a literary pseudo-public sphere. In this chapter, I compare Adams's April 7th and 10th letter to John Adams with her April 13th letter to Warren, two letters in which she quotes the same passage from Shakespeare's The Tragedy of Julius Caesar. I wanted to create this comparison in order to illuminate exactly what Adams's and Warren's female-female correspondence is and what makes it invaluable. So, in her correspondence with John Adams, just to give a little bit of context, she chronicles the funeral of General Warren, who is an esteemed patriot who died in the Battle of Bunker Hill and became known as the first martyr of the American Revolution. Adams's letters to her husband contextualize both Warren's funeral and the quote from Julius Caesar, overlapping the former onto the latter in order to place Morden, the orator, as the deliverer of Mark Antony's lines and highlight the similarities between Caesar's Civil War and the American Revolution. I put a little picture on the left side so you can get a sense of the progression that I'm talking about and how it changes when we talk about Warren and her letter to Warren. So here, in her letter to Warren on April 13th, she uses the same quote as talking about the same thing, but she decontextualizes Dr. Joseph Warren's funeral as well as the Mark Antony quote in order to place herself in the public masculine roles of modern orator and classical oracle. With Warren, Adams is much freer to body hop, which is a term that I coined that basically means this linguistic movement between classical and contemporary roles. And she's able to engage in a performance and experiment with what it would be like to occupy positions of power in the public sphere. For Adams, epistolary correspondence offers a means of escape and performative reinvention. However, this letter also reveals the limitations of epistolary writing, as this medium proves to be insufficient in letting Adams fully escape and erase the paradigms of Republican Stoicism. This section also helps to set up Warren's following section, as Adams and Warren's test the bounds of epistolary performativity in very different ways. The former figuratively hops out of her body, taking on multiple literary and historical personas, while the latter stays rooted within her own body, reassessing the potential behind her held identities as a playwright and historian. Thank you so much for listening. Hope you enjoyed.